Right, hi everyone. So for a little change, I'm not a biologist or toxicologist. I'm a social scientist and bioethicist. So it's a privilege for me to be here today in the midst of this workshop that is looking at the evidence, at the state of the science, and my interest in that is seeing the social and ethical implications of that work. And I hope that can also be useful for you in your thinking, because from what I know and what I've heard this morning, it is indeed a very important endpoint from your research, the translation in terms of public health and individual health. So bioethics, why it matters. So first, ethics, it's the decisions about what is the right thing to do. So when something is moral or ethical, it's because it's not the most pleasurable, the most advantageous, the most or the fortuitous thing to do. It's because it's right. So a number of different paths can be taken to decide what should be done. For example, in terms of regulation of tobacco. So there's the public health approach that's going to look at the health of the population as a whole. Legal approach. So making a decision in terms of what should be banned or authorized, and an ethical approach in terms of what is right or wrong. So the three do sometimes overlap, sometimes are confused, but are distinct approach. In terms of public health, one argument that is often used is the economic one, and it came up this morning several times, quantifying in terms of cost what tobacco would be. And that's a useful one because it brings quantification, and it's also often useful because it's morally neutral, and it's usually not a good idea to use moral criteria in terms of public decision making. But at the level of the individual, the moral question is indeed very important, and it takes a certain shape in terms of heritable issues. So the social implications and ethical implications of your work on tobacco are also ones of public awareness and creating a public conversation that is not so existent at the moment. And I think that social scientists and bioethicists can help also fostering this conversation in an interdisciplinary way. And so this conversation in two respects. First, in terms of tobacco and vaping exposure, and we've just seen right now how, I personally learned a lot about vaping, probably a lot of you too, and so this information is not around in the population. But even for tobacco, heritable effects of tobacco are not a well-known thing. I don't know if your own family, maybe when you talk about your work, so people around you know about it, but otherwise it's pretty much unknown. We just know, and all the health publicity about that is about personal exposure and in-utero exposure, but not beyond that. So there's a big public conversation here to have, but also in terms of germ cells. So if we're talking about heritable effects, we're talking about germ cell effects. But germ cells are basically an unknown actor in the public at large, I believe. What we talk about when we think of reproduction is the fetus, not germ cells. And somebody this morning, I think John said that we go back being PGCs. But who know what PGC is? Virtually nobody. So I think there's a huge stake of public communication, and I really like what Elena suggested just before, like having kids do an experiment. Scientific literacy is very important to democracy, I think, to citizens being able to decide what's important, not just in their personal behavior, but also in their voting behavior. So to talk a little bit about bioethical issues here, how they bear on the question of heritable effects of tobacco. So the way we frame the problem in bioethics in terms of what is right is what are our responsibility towards others. So what are our moral responsibilities towards others? And that needs to be decomposed in several elements. So I'll start first with that, maybe the last one. So others. Who are we talking when we're talking about others? We're talking first about everyone, but specifically vulnerable populations. So vulnerable, that's a concept that you use also in toxicology. And public health, in bioethics, it's also a codified concept. Vulnerable people are people who cannot attend themselves to their own rights and welfare, so they need to be protected. Traditionally, it's children, fetuses, pregnant women, but also prisoners. So these people need a special attention to have their rights entered. There's also a distinction between existing and future people, and that raises a big difficulty that I will go back to. How do we have responsibilities towards future generations or not? Then who is responsible? And it's also important to distinguish a whole lot of categories that will have implication on the types of responsibilities. Individuals, and we've talked today about adults, but also teenagers. A teenager is not considered, so is legally not of age and is not considered morally autonomous. It means that they don't have the rational abilities to make decisions for themselves, yet they make the decision to vape or smoke. So how do we equate that? But there's also collective responsibility in terms of making something available on the market and bringing the adequate research. And collective, it's both the state and corporation. And then what are responsibilities? Well, we need to think that actions are in terms of individual consumptions, but also in terms of creating markets, creating products, and doing the adequate research. So there's a complete network of responsibility. It's not just an individual problem, like an individual choosing to smoke or not to smoke, and then the effects on their offspring. It's a much more complicated issue. So now if we talk about accountability for tobacco exposure, there are two cases that we should distinguish. First, in utero and then in further generations. So in utero, that's something that has been largely discussed, and we can say that there's a moral accountability at two levels. First, individual who consumes, mother or father, and the level of corporation or state that may make a product available that's unsafe for consumption. But a few points that need to be underlined is, first, moral accountability implies knowledge. So you're not morally accountable for something that you didn't know was wrong. Conversely, as soon as you have this knowledge, then you become responsible. There's also a moral responsibility of corporations and agencies in ensuring product safety. It means that if they're not doing something they know they should, then they have a responsibility. And finally, individual responsibilities are complex. So this responsibility could be construed as the mother has an unconditional responsibility to preserve the health of the fetus. And it's not what I'm saying here. Because an individual also has responsibility towards themselves. So the responsibility towards the future offspring does not trump responsibilities towards oneself. So it's a more complicated issue that I'm not going to develop here. But now, germ cell exposure, that's a whole new question. Because here we're talking about long-term consequences. So consequences maybe 100 years down the line, where the people who are actually exposed, who actually consume tobacco, might be long dead. So are we supposed to be taking into account consequences of our action in such a long time? So what I argue is that if there is a chain of evidence that goes from further generations down the line, F5 or F4, to the first exposure, that it does create, the causal link does create a responsibility. But this responsibility has to be implemented now, in the present time. We're not going to be reporting on actions in 100 years. So we need to have this responsibility transfers onto germ cells. That it translates into a duty of protection of germ cells. But of course, it creates new issues because germ cells are not persons. They don't have rights. They cannot be represented in the system of law. So it needs to be part of a decision at the level of institutions. Now here, so I've been talking about using concepts of risk and certainty that you use also in risk assessment, but in a slightly different way. In terms of ethics, as soon as there's the knowledge of a risk, it creates an obligation. So it's more drastic than in terms of risk assessment, where you have to establish that there's a certain level of risk to implement some regulations. Here, in terms of future effect, the risk needs only to be minimal to require a form of action. And in the case of long-term germ cell exposure, we're in a landscape that is kind of new, but applies to a lot of the new technologies. In terms of scientific uncertainty, we don't know exactly what the effects are going to be. We don't know that for sure that they're going to be effects. Long-term effects, they're so far ahead that they're not easily tested. Magnitude of effects, potentially in terms of mutations and disease, the effects could be really large. So all those elements are what prompted philosopher Hans Jonas to suggest a principle of precaution. So in the EU, this has been registered in the Constitution. Whether it's actually applied is another story, unfortunately. But it's the idea that it guides a behavior at the collective level and at the level of law to actually implement this moral thinking. So that's not the only way to confront this, but this is one that has been pretty solid. So finally, another aspect that I'd like to highlight in terms of biological explication is the male-female bias. So it came up several times today that there's very few data in research and in data collection about females. So that's a form of bias. But all the data that's collected about sperm and males is actually helping to rebalance a situation that was highly biased against women. So traditionally, since a very long time ago with maternal effects in genetics, and more recently with in utero exposures, the responsibility has been laid over women. And so this image is from an article that entitled "Don't Blame the Mother," including with the neuro research and epigenetics. That was the topic of this article. Don't focus everything on the mother. And I think the research on male effects on germ cells is very interesting because it shows that the responsibility of effects are also on fathers. So I think that's also something important in the way you frame your research, and in framing it in a way that the social implications are going to be grasped. I mean, the way you present your research has an impact on what people are going to understand. So I thought the picture that Carol showed from Dr. Beale, I don't remember his first name, was very interesting. How do you represent the father? It's always, the picture is usually a pregnant woman's belly, usually without the head, that's presented as the environment for reproduction. Actually, the environment is much larger. It includes sperm. It includes also the whole environment, air exposure, indoor and outdoors. And so that also needs to be taken into account and not simplified into the uterus is the relevant environment. All right, with that, I'll stop, and I will thank GL Lab at UCLA, which I am part of, and my funding sources. Thank you.
So about the idea that we're talking about long-term distant effects that are hard to ascertain now. I mean, my argument would be that that's not true at all. We're talking about immediate effects, that maybe the phenotype isn't perceived until later. But I'm always troubled when researchers tell me something like, well, Jill, you're really interested in such attenuated effects. And I'm like, no, I'm talking about what's actually happening in the germ cells in real time, right, as a toxicological event. Yes, the manifestation might not be perceived, right, until 20, 30 years later, maybe even more. But still, there is a present danger. And I think that that's lost, that biochemistry that's happening just somehow gets lost and is sort of passed off as something that happens later. I think we need to change our minds about that.
Yeah, I think one of the big difficulties here is the time, indeed, and the status of germ cells. Because what you're saying right now is that the effects are immediate, they're present. It's true, they're present in the germ cells, and they're not necessarily visible in the individual. because they're going to manifest when this individual reproduces, and potentially only when the offspring is grown up. So there's a delay between our perception of the consequence and the action. And so that also goes back to how do we consider germ cells in this question. They don't have a moral or legal status, and biologically they're also part of another body. So they're not. It's very hard to individuate them, and yet I agree we need to, in order to be able to assess the issue at the correct time instead of with a delay.
Because I think the time aspect is not different from cancer, which goes over many years. So the time aspect should be, but I can see the issue of the germ cells not being persons.
Mm-hmm. So I think you're right. It's not different from cancer. It's probably more extreme because it goes over not just over one generation, but also affects further generations down the line.